Georgina Fuller, who's a parenting author and journalist. Good morning to you, Georgina.
Good morning,
Thank
Julia.
you very much. Now,
Hello.
I'm not entirely sure that this particular case is a great example. I mean, he says, look, he was worried if something happened to the kids. The dad said, he would lose his rights to see the child. So you've got a complicated divorce settlement in there as well. So I think we should leave that bit aside. But is the judge fundamentally right that we are now mollycoddling our kids and being overprotective, so much so that actually we're turning them into snowflakes?
I think the judge is absolutely right on this, and I agree with what you're saying. And I think there was a statistic in that article in 1971, 80% of children walked to school, and now it's something like 25%.
Yeah,
And that speaks volumes, doesn't it, about our attitude to gentle parenting
yeah,
and how we do mollycoddle
yeah.
and wrap up our kids in cotton wool. And I know, unfortunately, that means that they're not learning any sort of resilience or
Yeah.
independence or
Yeah,
basic life
and the
skills.
independence is so crucial, isn't it? I mean, I remember when my daughter first started walking to school, I think it was in year 6, so the last year of primary school, and she sort of begged and demanded it. And I was quite anxious, even though it's a 10-minute walk. And I thought, I actually had a conversation with myself, stop being such a nutter. You were walking to school when you were 6 years old, which I was in Birmingham with my brother who was 7. He was more of a risk to me than stranger danger. But we become, as parents, obsessed with stranger danger. We are absolutely convinced that there is a dodgy man waiting to grab our children, behind every hedge, behind every street corner. Statistically, that is not the case. But when
No,
we do have those cases, and they've been very highly publicised cases, they frighten the living daylights out of us. And we are absolutely convinced our children are permanently at risk, aren't we?
they are. I mean, social media and obviously the general media all magnifies that. And, that is our worst fear as parents. Of course it is. But as you say, statistically, that's actually not very likely. And people haven't changed fundamentally from the
Exactly.
70s, from the 60s. People are people. And, unfortunately, awful things happen, but we can't live our lives on that basis and we
Yeah,
can't inflict that upon our children.
yeah,
And I think gentle parenting seems to be very much kind of on trend at the moment.
yeah.
And
There
there's
is
so many
that.
different terms. There's helicopter parenting, free range parenting. And I grew up, in the 80s, and my mother's sort of motto was healthy neglect. And I'm the third. So,
Oh, I'm going to tell my mum
we just,
about that. That's what she'll say.
yeah,
But
I
people
mean,
were busy. People had lives to be getting on with. But also I think it was a safer environment in lots of ways, simply because there were so many other children on the streets. When we were told in school holidays at 9 o'clock, get out of the house, here's your cheese sandwich, don't come back till dinner time. I don't want to see you, we're busy. I mean, my mum was working, my stepfather was working, my dad, my stepmom, everyone was busy. You couldn't be at home. We were on the streets with loads of other kids.
yes, and now we do have a fear of letting our children get bored, and because of screens. I think your guest mentioned earlier, and and
Mm.
I agree with that. And boredom again is something that you have to learn to live with, and you
Yeah.
can't be entertained all the time.
Yeah,
And that
and
kind of
sometimes you have
falls
to
over
walk around a
into
supermarket and it's not fun. I remember saying to my daughter once, but it's not fun for me either. I mean, but it has to be done or there'll be no food.
yeah.
That's
I mean,
life.
I have a daughter the same age as this couple's two children. My youngest is 9,
Mm,
and she walks to the bus stop at the end of our lane. We live in a
yeah,
small village. She loves it. She's just started doing it this year in year
yeah,
5. She's really proud of herself. She gets herself up. She gets herself dressed. And that's a,
yeah,
a kind of life skill that she will hopefully
yeah.
carry with her
Well, isn't
for
it
the rest
interesting?
of her.
You even used the phrase life skill. This would have been taken for granted in days gone by. But again, I also think, like I've got an only child, and Claire, you've got an only child as well. And then the situation where you probably are a bit more protective. And whereas it's in our day, I had, a sibling at home and, older sibling. And in days gone by, there would have been a load of siblings. And the older sibling, the 13-year-old would be taking care of the 3-year-old. And you lived in the same street. And for many, many, many millions of people, you lived in the same street as other family members. You'd lived there all your life. We live very kind of disjointed, separate lives now, often from our families.
Yeah,
So
I
you
mean,
might not know anyone in the street. You've only got one kid, or they're 2 kids very close in age, and there aren't other kids in the street who can look after your kid and say, "Oh, shouldn't you be at home now?" And look, I can understand why some of those fears have grown up, but they're completely misplaced, aren't they?
They are, and you're right. Our sense of community has sadly eroded, and that whole "it takes a village." And yeah, when I grew up, I knew every single house, every single person that lived there. And we don't have the same sense of community now, and we live miles away from our family members as well. But
Mm.
actually, again, that's not an excuse. It shouldn't mean that we don't give our children any freedom, because they still have to learn to live independently
Yeah.
within the outside world. And yes, and I think also, as you mentioned, the fact that we are having less children, it was 2.4, it's 1.8 or something now, I think, statistically.
Yeah.
So obviously, I was probably a lot more kind of hands on with my first child,
Yeah,
who's now
everyone
nearly
is.
15, than I am
Second
with
one, you
my
kind of
third.
step over. I'm
Well, you
told.
do,
I'm told. I
you've
didn't
done
get
all of
that
it.
privilege. I started too late. But I wonder also whether you think, part of this is down to guilt parenting. I've never had any time for this. I remember doing a radio show once where I made women call up and told me, yes, I go out to work and I pay half the mortgage. And how dare you feel guilty about doing that? There's not a man in the world who feels guilty about that. And lots of people sort of trying to make up for sort of, oh, I don't think I'm doing the job right, and I'm not here all the time, so I'm going to be overprotective and give you everything you possibly want, so you never feel anything but joy and happiness and excitement in your heart. And every weekend it's like another activity and another this, as opposed to like we were just told, when are you going out? you know, and again, you say like that sort of, level of sort of loving neglect where kids are just their days are sort of timetables and
Yeah.
and just not allowed. Maybe sometimes you do just want to flop on the sofa and read a book. I mean, of course, they're not allowed to read a book. It's not interesting enough now. It has to be a gadget.
A short attention span. I mean, it's part of
Mm,
this helicopter parenting trend, which has become more and more prevalent. And as you say, you often hear working mothers, and you hear mum guilt. You never hear the
yeah,
term dad guilt.
yeah.
It's just not even a thing. And I think it's because, I mean, there was another story out this week about wives being unhappier or losing the loving feeling more than husbands. And I think that's because mothers traditionally, we do carry the responsibility, we carry the guilt, we still do the majority of cooking and
Mm,
housework, and we structure our children's
yeah.
days because we are, as you say,
Yeah.
sort of time poor.
Yeah, but also, the work-life balance is a much bigger issue for most women and most families. And again, I don't think it is. People always, the younger women who don't have kids always talk about this being sexism. I think it's no. I think it's just women have different priorities, and I know every woman I know feels that way.